Hi, this is Mark, and welcome to episode 26 of Nerdology, sponsored by CSO The Cult Fanzine. And my special guests today are Deb Stanish and Erik Stadnik. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Erik, you sound really full of beans.
Yes, I am full of beans. Hi, Mark. It's great to be back.
Have we got Erik
for
Bot now?
15th time? Is that what this is? My 15th guest appearance, I think.
Well, you can't have too much of a good thing, can you, Erik?
Or me either, apparently. But I'm very glad that you asked me back.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And we have the wonderful Deb Stanish.
Well, hello there. This is like, I feel like I'm piggybacking on Erik's coattails here because he's he's the permanent guest status. But.
Well, that's how I get listeners to my podcast. I just get someone good in, and it tends to bump the figures up a bit. So that's what I'm hoping.
The Erik Stadnik spike.
Yeah, exactly. It works a treat. Now, Deb, for the uninitiated, is the co-editor of the Hugo-nominated Chicks Unravel Time. Mm-hmm. Weren't you involved in Chicks Dig Time Lords as well?
Yeah, I contributed an essay to Chicks Dig Time Lords, and then I went on with Lynn Thomas, who co-edited that anthology, to do Whedonistas, which is sort of a similar book in the world of Joss Whedon properties. And I've contributed to all sorts of things, Outside In, the first Outside In, and the Time Unincorporated series as well, and I just recently did an essay for Apex Magazine. So, yeah, there's little bits of me sprinkled throughout anthologies and Doctor Whoville.
And Erik, you've recently been involved in Queers Dig Time Lords.
Yeah, that was prompted by Deb. I suggested the idea for Queers Dig Time Lords to the publisher who had done Chicks Dig Time Lords and Chicks Unravel Time and Whedonistas, and thought it would be a good next step, and then wrote an essay for that, and apparently have an upcoming essay coming in February in Outside In 2, and I think I wrote something else, but I honestly can't remember at this point.
So keep your eyes peeled when you book
I
shows.
might be published somewhere in something about some stuff.
Yeah.
Excellent. Nice and vague. That's the way we like it. So the reason we got you two together, I mean, you two are good friends in real life.
I can't stand her.
Yeah, I've heard that rumor. I didn't like to mention it.
I still have a bottle of your red licorice vodka in my car. So yeah,
well, how did you end up? Oh, fuck.
Nobody wanted it. We were at last weekend. We were at a con, and I was the only person that didn't fly. So they were like, "You have to take this stuff home," and I still don't quite know what to do with it.
You ended up with all the booze.
Well, it wasn't that much left actually, but
well,
what can I say?
Was this the Long Island 2 con?
Yes, which was last weekend. Mm-hmm. Well, last weekend.
You guys were all over that, weren't you?
Yeah, we were. There was a bunch of us there. Chip from 2 Minute Time Lord was there, and we had Graham Burke and Robert Smith, and yeah, it was a really good time for a first year con. It was remarkably hitch-free, I would say. I'm sure that things didn't run perfectly, but they really did a nice job in sort of with addressing the needs of the diverse group of people that were going to be there. Lots of panel diversity, and really being adaptable to things as they were changing, which I always everybody who goes to a con thinks they can do it better, but you really don't know until you've run a con. And I think they did a nice job.
Friends of mine organised one earlier this year, and it's a hell of a lot of work. And I think they only really realised how much work it was partway through setting it up, and they did an incredible job. But people keep asking them, "Oh, are you going to have the same thing next year?" And they're thinking, "Well, maybe we need a year off just to get over the previous one." But I'm sure they'll do something again.
Yeah.
So you two. Unless I'm mistaken, I've not heard you both together on the same podcast, so I thought that would be a nice little dynamic to have.
We've never been on a podcast together, have we, Erik?
That's a vicious lie.
Other
that is a vicious lie. Other than your very first podcast appearance ever, which was when I was still co-hosting Bridging the Rift.
Oh, Bridging the Rift.
And you came on to promote Chicks Dig Time Lords, and it was your very first podcast appearance ever.
I had forgotten about that because I wasn't supposed to do that podcast.
No.
And Lynn and I were working on Whedonistas at the time, and Tara O'Shea, who was her co-editor couldn't make it, and she emailed me and said, "Are you available in 15 minutes? I'm doing a podcast." And I was like, "Okay." And I think I actually talked into my computer, there was no mics.
The sound quality was significantly lower than
no idea what
now.
I was doing. So yes, and then I read for you once for Doctor Who Book Club.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
but that was just sending an audio file. So we've actually sort of appeared twice together. But
Okay.
Since you've become a podcaster,
So-
this is the first actual together.
yes.
Now, I asked you guys what you'd like to come on and talk about, and you came back with Agatha Christie.
Yes, we did.
And what prompted you to come up with that? Why is it a big passion for you both?
Well, I think actually I was emailing Erik about this and what can we talk to that we both have in common or things that we really like? And we kind of narrowed it down, I think, to Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Agatha Christie. Because while there are things that we like, I think our nerd buckets tend to run fairly differently and fairly shallowly when it comes to some more genre properties. At least that was sort of my take on it. And I knew this was something that because we had a conversation at one point where we were talking about comfort reading, and I remember him saying that Agatha Christie was sort of his go-to comfort reading, and it seemed like a fun idea because I had gone through a very passionate Agatha Christie phase in my life, and I thought it would be kind of fun to revisit that. So what was your sort of impetus in going with that choice, Erik?
Me? I don't know. I think I wanted to come on Mark's show with something I didn't have to prepare as much for.
Oops.
Oops. Actually, no. Given the amount of time spent preparing for the things, knocking out the 4 novels, which I only made it through 3 3/4, but still, was so much less work because I know the stories already. Everything is sort of familiar. They're not difficult books. They are comfort reading, and so plopping down of an evening, and doing 200 pages of an Agatha Christie when you have nothing else to do that night is not difficult. Doing that with Dickens was a challenge.
Yeah. I have to confess, I cheated somewhat in as much as I've mentioned on many occasions, my attention span is not great, and I have quite a big collection of audiobooks. So as well as having the sort of fun of revisiting Agatha Christie novels, I got to have them read to me by acclaimed actors who've been in roles in Christie novels. So that was quite a nice way of experiencing them. So we had Joan Hickson reading the Marple story, which I think she's brilliant.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, that's not a hardship there. I think that's actually
No.
Yeah.
And I tend to find, because I'm a very quick reader, that when I'm listening to an audiobook, I pick up so many more nuances of the story because it forces you to slow down and really focus, where I tend to my eyes jumping to the end of the page to find out what's going on. So I have come to appreciate audiobooks a little bit more, not just as something I can do while I'm doing something else, but sometimes it really makes me concentrate and pick up the details that I may have missed if I'm not giving something a close reading and just sort of reading it for pleasure.
No, that's true.
So we picked a few variations because Agatha Christie had her kind of stable of recurring characters. So probably the 2 most notable would be Poirot and Miss Marple. But we also have the characters of Tommy and Tuppence, and also the mysterious Mr. Quinn as well. So we came up with a short list of sort of picks to represent those characters.
Yeah, Erik actually selected the 4 representative books. I'm really curious because I didn't
select. you advised.
You just threw them all up in the air and just.
we had
picked the first one.
talked about what sort of seminal characters we should discuss and where we wanted to go, and these were your selections. And I'm kind of curious as to why you picked these particular novels, because I think you had a sort of obviously the Harley Quinn was sort of easy because there's not that many of them.
Yeah, and I firmly believe that the Mr. Quinn stories are an interesting aspect of her writing that most people who think of Christie don't think of the mysterious Mr. Quinn and the Mr. Satterthwaite sort of pairing. And I think it's quite interesting and worth looking at especially in the context of what she does other places. So that was sort of, there's only the one collection of short stories and a few other stray short stories. So that
I have a theory that Mr. Quinn is a time lord.
he could be anything. He's a hell of a thing. So that was easily slotted in. You, Deb, are a big fan of Tommy and Tuppence. I was I was kind of prepared to leave Tommy and Tuppence alongside the road. But I'm glad we didn't. And so we went with NRM, which is the sort of middle book of, I guess, their 3 or 4 books. Because there's By the Pricking of My Thumbs, which is like a late Tommy and Tuppence.
Right.
And then
Secret
there's Partners in Crime.
Adversaries. Yeah.
Yeah.
So their stories really go from the time they meet until like they're very elderly, which I think is interesting.
They're the only characters in Christie who really age, which is quite interesting, in something resembling real time. And then, you have the Poirot and the Marple. And I actually picked the 2 that I think not necessarily are the best mysteries, the most famous mysteries. I think if you do that, then you clearly probably go with Murder of Roger Ackroyd or Murder on the Orient Express. It's harder to tell what the definitive Marple is, maybe Body in the Library. But I went with the 2 that made emotional impacts, which is rare for Christie's novels. Is that 2 that actually seemed to be plumbing the depths of humanity a bit deeper. They're not just sort of mysteries. They actually seem to have maybe a little bit of something to say about life.
And they also employ slightly different mechanics in the way that the mystery is tackled.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and she has an entire phase where she kind of gets very focused on memory and stuff, and things like that, and kind of recalling past events. And Murder in Retrospect, which is also called Five Little Pigs, depending on the edition, is the best of those, in my opinion. And it is the purest Poirot can be. He goes, he talks to people, he sits it, and he figures it out. That is all that happens.
I thought it was a nice contrast between, and I'm reading the Five Little Pigs edition, between that and A Murder's Announced, because they're very similar, and let's go talk to people about what happened.
Yeah.
And so it was a nice parallel because it's sort of a similar technique but done completely differently in a different context.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
And of course, the thing with Five Little Pigs, which makes it somewhat different for a murder mystery, is that the murder happened years ago.
Yeah, and it's 16 years before the start of the novel, and a woman was convicted and jailed and died in prison. Although it's interesting, in the TV adaptation, I'm 99% sure they had her actually be hanged, which
really?
is it's expressly not done in the novel. They say she wasn't hanged, but I'm pretty sure in the movie version, which is pretty solid and faithful in most respects, although it does twist a few things here and there, they actually do have her be executed. Should we start with that, since that's sort of where we're talking right now already?
Why not?
So, Deb, I don't know what you thought of any of these, except for I know that Tommy and Tuppence maybe, but we'll talk about that. What did you think?
Well, it's funny because I went through a very intense Agatha Christie phase when I was much, much younger. And I think I was probably 18 or 19. And I was working my way through college and had a job in Wilmington, Delaware, which, the city. And there was a little, very tiny little city. There was a little used bookstore around the corner from my office. And I would go in there during my lunch hour, and somebody had cleared out their entire paperback Christie library, and I think the books were a dime. And every couple days I go in and grab another handful. So I sort of immersed myself at that point. And I remember really not liking Poirot as much. He was probably my least favorite of all the ones that I read. But going back and reading this now, many years later as an adult, I think of all the stories that we read, I enjoyed this one the most. I think there's sort of a technical skill in this writing and the way that she approached this story. And I don't know whether I'd feel that way going back and reading all the Poirots, but in this particular, of the 4 that we selected, I found myself most captivated and appreciating the writing of this story, perhaps more than the Tommy and Tuppence NRM, which I thought that I was going to go back and adore because I just love those 2 characters and I love their relationship. And I kind of was seeing all the technical difficulties in that book that I probably missed when I was 18 and 19. And they bothered me much more this time around. But I really enjoyed the structure of this. I enjoyed sort of the machinations of Poirot and the personalities that he assumed based on each person that he was interviewing. And I particularly, knowing what we know about Agatha Christie and her personal life, you can't help but read into that, how she treated, should we spoil these books? Can we spoil them for people?
I think they were published at the most recently 60 years ago. I think we're going to have to spoil them. Yeah.
All right. So, in unmasking the murder is the person who was trying to steal the husband, of the of the person who was murdered. You sort of really see it's, and I try not to do that, but I couldn't help projecting her own personal relationship because her husband did leave her for his mistress, and it caused her to sort of have some sort of a breakdown, which is all up for debate as to what actually happened, even though anybody who watched Doctor Who knows that it's all because of a giant wasp. But she disappeared for a week after this all occurred. So I couldn't help myself from projecting that a little bit and how she treated this very cold, icy character, who was the young girl who was trying to steal the husband of the woman who was convicted of murder. But I found myself slowing down to read this one a little bit more because I liked how it was being played out. And it wasn't as dialogue heavy as some of the other novels that we were reading in this series. So this one really caught me much more than I thought. I was surprised.
Haha. Point for me.
I think a lot of these type of novels, you always have those sort of red herrings that get thrown in there to try and throw you off the scent. But I think she's great at giving you just enough where you're swaying between different characters as to I'm absolutely certain now it's got to be this person, and she does a great job of that. I think she's a real populist writer. I don't know if she's necessarily one of the most gifted technical writers, but she understands characters, and she's great at, obviously in her background, she worked with medicines, didn't she? So she knows all about sort of poison.
Yeah, she was in a dispensary in World War One.
So you get this kind of verisimilitude to it, that you get that reality in the way it all plays out. But I find her sort of murder mysteries quite. It's like putting on an old pair of shoes, really sort of comfortable. You can sit down and enjoy it and take it in. And the characters. I mean, I know. Perhaps with the passing of time, certain aspects of life back then aren't quite seen in the same way. I think you can generally regard, having read most of the books, that foreigners aren't to be trusted, for starters. Even if they're completely legit, no, they're a bad egg.
Yes, foreigners, lower class. It's very classism is sort of rampant throughout. But.
Yeah. What's interesting, though, is she frequently subverts or inverts that. She'll have the really unpleasant characters mistrust foreigners, and she has, through Poirot, in Murder Retrospect and in other books, she has him talk about the fact that the Englishman thinks that because he looks the way he does and talks the way he does, he clearly must be an idiot, and he plays that up, and so it's sort of like she uses that. And she falls victim to it too. She's a creature of her times, but she's at least somewhat aware of the fact that the English attitude of foreigners, what rot, is seriously flawed and leads to a great many troubles. Which I think.
Yeah, and I think you see that even more so.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see that even more so, I think, in NRM, because the foreigner characters in that one, all turn out to be the good guys are very trustworthy, and it is the very hale and hearty Englishman who turns out to be the spy, the fifth columnist, because you have the German and you have the foreign woman who turned out to actually be Betty's mother, and they're all very, very suspicious characters, and they're all played to type, and they all turn out to be quite innocent, and I thought that was sort of, like you said, it was subverting that trope of you can't trust these, that sort of builds up throughout her writing.
So what did you think revisiting Tommy and Tuppence? Because I find Tommy and Tuppence charming. I find their stories to be kind of bleh. And this was no exception. I thought the storyline of NRM was really, it's like when she had a sort of half-baked spy idea, she would throw Tommy and Tuppence in to make it, worth reading, but that's about it. I don't think she pays the same attention to detail with her thrillers as she does with her mysteries.
I'm not that well versed with them. I've read By the Pricking of
My Thumbs, yeah.
My Thumbs, yeah, quite some time ago. I liked the change of pace. I thought it was something a little bit different. And I like them as a couple. I think they work really well as like a team. I think they're very cute.
I just wanted to tell you, my Skype completely dropped there for about for the last couple of minutes. So
Okay.
I miss what you guys said about everything after my last comment. So
We just were saying that Tommy and Tuppence were charming, but the plots in which they were settled are often sort of meh, and they don't have the same technical skill as her mystery stories.
I cannot argue with that. and I think, the strength of those particular books is their banter and is their relationship. And again, coming back to this much later in life, I was kind of appalled at how weak the story actually was. But their relationship is just so delightful. And I guess I was reading it for that reason, or I appreciate the story for that reason.
Yeah. Although I think, maybe I'm finding gold where there isn't any, but I think it's interesting that she again kind of subverts things where she does something she doesn't often do in her books, which is withhold, or she makes you think the main character, the main detective in this case, which is Tuppence, because Tommy is kind of sidelined fairly near the end, and actually isn't that helpful beforehand. Tuppence is made to seem to the reader and to the characters around her as if she's being led down a certain path, when in fact she's had it figured out much longer. And she at the end gets to say, haha, I knew all along. And you're like, oh, Tuppence is actually way smarter than I thought she was. She figured it out. And because I was reading, and like the scene where Mrs. Sprott killed the supposed kidnapper, I was like, there's no way she takes that shot and makes it. I was like, there's no way. And then sure enough, that's exactly the same thing that made Tuppence go, something's funny.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, so Tuppence is at least as smart as I am.
And then, but there's little clues that are dropped throughout. And I used to play the game, could I figure out who the murderer was? And I don't have that same compulsion now, but I was trying to be quite clever. And there are enough clues that you sort of can figure it out. And I know in this story, and she kept talking about Solomon and Solomon and Solomon. And, when you know that story, you can sort of see where they're going with it. And even in Five Little Pigs, when Poirot was reading the letter that Caroline had left for his sister, and said what was the line? Debts must be repaid. And I thought that struck me as very interesting when I read that. And of course, then you can kind of see how that all extrapolates out. So I think she gives you enough that you could, but with N or M, I don't think I could have untangled that, because there were so many twists and turns and who knew what, and yeah.
Yeah, I think you could come to the conclusion that Mrs. Sprott isn't what she appears to be,
right.
But that she had kidnapped that woman's baby is a bit strange.
Yeah, that came out of nowhere.
The shoelace thing, I also was like, okay, clearly he's being framed, but the fact that the commander, who had only appeared twice previously in sort of smallish scenes, was actually like that whole double bluff thing going on with him was a bit much. I also thought it was interesting that here's a story about two people in, let's say, early middle age. They're in their mid to late 40s, who feel past it and no one wants their service in the World War II, and they did all this work in World War I and shortly thereafter. And their kids always kind of pity them. Oh, the old dears, they don't know. And her daughter just about gets them all killed.
Yes.
Because she can't keep her mouth shut about what her parents might have done during the previous war. And it's like, I'm sorry, if my parents told me that they were secret agents, I wouldn't share that with anybody. It's like basic child of secret agent 101. And I think it's a slightly older Christie writing about slightly older Tommy and Tuppence is getting her chance to sort of skewer the younger generation who thinks people maybe her age are a bit past it, which
when I was reading this at 18 or 19, I'm like, well, yeah, you are sort of out there, can't you just sort of calm down? Now, in my 40s, I'm like, are you kidding me? I had a much different reaction to that conversation than I did when I wasn't rolling my eyes at, the exposition dump in the beginning of everything they had done and the years that they had done it as they're having this conversation with themselves. That was one of those awkward things that I kind of cringed as an editor. I wanted to take my red pen to that very badly.
Yeah, no, it's really just the Tommy and Tuppence books, which are all sort of these spy thrilleries or very, that sort of thing, as opposed to traditional murder mysteries. they're all, I think they're just poorly written, comparatively speaking. She had a different sort of thing she was going for, and she's much less tidy and everything. And because they're kind of spaced out, she does kind of feel the need to do a lot of info summary and things like that, and just cramming of information in sometimes. And it's just, they don't really hold up, and in the same way, I don't think. And she has other, spy sort of thrillery novels that don't feature Tommy and Tuppence, and they're, for me at least, of a piece. I haven't read them, none of them in a while, but They Came to Baghdad and things like this, and they're all just sort of a bit. They're very creaky. They're very, very creaky. There's a reason James Bond became famous and her spies never did.
It's a little bit like George Clooney sort of slumming it and doing a few sort of brainless thriller movies in between doing Steven Soderbergh movies.
That's a good analogy. But again, if for somebody who adored those characters, I ate those novels up with a spoon because I loved their relationship, and I think that's an aspect of those novels that sort of redeem them for me.
No, I think definitely it's Tommy and Tuppence are great together. If there were just Tommy and Tuppence hanging around the house for a day, I would watch that. That would be
calling each other old dear
and making fun of each other slightly, and then suddenly having really serious moments where they kind of express their love for each other. And they're sweet, they're funny, they're an interesting couple. They're probably the only happily married couple in all of Christie I can think of. Actually, they remind me in some ways, or at least Tuppence does, reminds me of Ariadne Oliver, who we didn't read about, but who's the sort of Christie alter ego in the novels. The mystery writer who helps out Poirot a couple times. And also Bunch, who's in A Murder Is Announced.
Yes.
I
love Bunch.
Bunch is wonderful, the smarter-than-she-looks vicar's wife, who is kind of blundering in, but always knows much more than she's going on. Did you think, and this is just a weird thing I got from reading Murders Announced this time, did you think Bunch was sitting there trying to learn how to be Miss Marple? Sitting there at her knee when Jane's explaining everything and being like, oh, so that's how you knew. She almost seems to be really wanting to be Miss Marple when she grows up.
Yeah, you do kind of get that impression because she is sort of fumbly and bumbly and, talking about her borders and, she's such an interesting character because I think it's indicative of the whole Miss Marple sort of mystique. It's the person who is so underestimated until they're in the know. Obviously you have the people that dismiss Jane Marple, out of hand as being this sort of wifty little cotton-haired, white-haired old woman who knits a lot. Knitting figures very prominently in a lot of Agatha Christie novels, by the way.
Yes, it does.
And and I think Bunch is similarly underestimated because she does sort of, whether intentionally or unintentionally, kind of stumbles onto the right answer a lot in the novels that she's in. So, yeah, I can totally see her, learning the art of observation from Miss Marple because that's really sort of all it is.
Yeah, and finding those comparisons between, human behaviors. It's a similar sort of approach. It's quote unquote the psychological approach that Poirot always espouses, but it's done in terms of analogy. Essentially, it's oh, I knew that man was the thief because he reminded me of that butcher's boy who always took a little extra piece of bacon for himself or whatever.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting. But what strikes me about Murders Announced is it's such a crazy idea for how to do it. And it is of all the plots that she has, the one where there's an ad placed in the paper saying that someone's going to be killed, and sure enough, someone is killed, and everyone sees it happen. They still don't know what happened. I think is just fabulous. That's such a good sort of mechanic. But the other is I love how good she is at making you like and sympathize with Miss Blacklock. You like her a lot, and then at the end you find out, oh, she's the killer. And that's what makes it kind of really emotional for me. Is that as emotional as Christie gets, at least, is when she's when Miss Marple has imitated Dora Bunner's voice to freak out Letitia Blacklock, who's actually Charlotte Blacklock in a whole stolen identity thing. She says, Miss Blacklock says, you really shouldn't have done that. I really loved Dora. And it's she did. She loved this person that she killed because she couldn't have her around anymore. But she's it's rare that, Christie murderers sort of collapse into a heap of sobs at the end, as opposed to, oh, I would have gotten away for you, They're usually sort of
It wasn't for you meddling kids.
They're usually fairly snarly at the end, or sort of, unrepentant, at least somewhere or the other, whereas Letitia's just defeated. She's utterly just defeated. She tries one last crazy attempt to drown Mitzi, which I don't know how the hell that would have gotten away with. But, she just completely collapses. And I love her sort of growing panic as the novel goes on, that you think is her being panicked about who's someone trying to kill her. And then you realize everything is kind of spiraling out of control.
Right.
And her reaction when they think Miss Marple's been done away with, is she's completely baffled because she's killing people. So she knows who the murderer is. And she's like, who would want to kill her? What is going on? She's like, is somebody... and that's when she really starts to lose it. And the scene where the pearls go and she completely...
This book is so fascinating too, because we don't even, at least in my edition, I don't think we see Miss Marple until page 67.
That's
like
about right.
A quarter of the way through the book, we finally, more than a quarter actually, bring Jane Marple into this story. So, this idea of having this outside observer, not really engaged in the action, which is something that I think Poirot and Marple both sort of touch upon. They're not part of events, but they're just sort of these observers that drop these little nuggets of, well, this could have happened and this this thing happened, and it's so obvious in this book because we don't even see her until way into the game after they're interviewing everybody and all the action has already occurred. So I find that an interesting storytelling device of not bringing your detective in until pretty darn late in the game.
I think also with Marple, because she's just this nice little old lady who just happens to wander into all these situations, you can't really have her there from word go, I guess, because it would just seem a bit hokey maybe, whereas Poirot is the detective and he's hired to seek out these cases. So I suppose it gives it a little bit more of a realistic impression. But I grew up with Marple when I was a little kid. Joan Hickson was playing her on the BBC adaptation, so that was my introduction to Agatha Christie. And my mum comes from Somerset, which is in the countryside in England, and all of the sort of locations for these stories are very evocative of that sort of countryside. So it does feel kind of rooted in reality, albeit a slightly heightened sort of... how should I put it?
Sort of idealized.
Slightly heightened, idealized,
It's rose tinged. Although I think it's interesting. Murder's Announced. She deals with the fact that the country village isn't the country village anymore.
Yeah, it's all about identity.
Yeah,
isn't it?
And it's about you can now move to a small little village and you don't have letters of introduction. Mm-hmm. You don't know Colonel so and so who used to live up the Grange or whatever. And it's sort of this modern England is starting to emerge. And Miss Marple's adjusting to it, but she doesn't seem fond of it necessarily. And I think yes.
Yeah, you can see that throughout the course of her, starting at the beginning with Murder of Roger Ackroyd. You can really see sort of the whole change of English society as we kind of move through the novels, not sequentially, but by publication date and how things have changed, because it is very much a Downton Abbey world in the early novels, and then that sort of everybody still has servants, at least a servant, even if you're in a flat.
That's kind of interesting in itself as a sort of social document, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And I think as an American, sort of, because we kind of eat that stuff up with a spoon at times, and it's really fascinating to look at a glimpse. And I think you realize that it is not certainly accurate or 100% accurate. It is more an idealized version, but to sort of see what life was like, and reading that, and it's an interesting social commentary because it's nothing like we have here in the States. So it was kind of a peek into a different world in reading these when I was younger.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that was part of the attraction when I first discovered the Christie novels when I was quite young. I think I probably got them through the David Suchet Poirot, which has just concluded finally after 20 plus years or whatever of him playing the role. He's finally now starred in every Poirot story, I believe, which is crazy pants. But they were on when I was, 10, 11, 12, and I started just getting the Christie novels. And because they're safe mystery books. Like, if you want a kid who's into that sort of stuff and you don't want swearing or a lot of violence or whatnot, it's like, Agatha Christie, she's a solid writer. She's not going to teach them anything fascinating about, like, prose style or something, but she's going to be fun and engaging and rare enough for someone who's kind of writing about murder a lot. Not super violent, and sex is kind of kept mainly off stage and things, and that's always nice. But when I first read Murders Announced, I was probably 12 or 13, and then I read it again when I was in 20s, and I was like, there's a lesbian couple in this.
Yeah.
And she never says it, but she says everything but.
Right.
Yeah.
She does. She provides you all the information you need to draw the conclusion, oh, these women are life partners. As opposed to just two ladies who happen to share a cottage together, which is how I read it probably when I was like 10 or 11 or 12.
And I think that makes the murder even, a little bit more horrifying, realizing that.
It does. And that's the thing. All the murders in this, except for the first one, feel really painful. They're not in Murders Announced. They're not, oh, that annoying person got killed, or oh, the rich old man who's a bastard to his kids got killed. As in many of the books, it is a random guy who was in the wrong. Essentially, was kind of a bit shady, but not really bad. And then a heartwarming, sweet, fuzzy-headed woman, and then a really sweet character who has someone who loves her desperately. And it's like, that's awful. That's really awful. And that's kind of the sort of destruction that murder can bring that I think she kind of glosses over a lot, but really hits home in Murders Announced, and also in Five Little Pigs. I think that what you have at the end of Five Little Pigs is that this entire group of people who were all very close is kind of destroyed by this one act of violence perpetrated by someone essentially from the outside, which is interesting. But like the brothers Blake don't talk to each other much. They haven't seen Angela Warren in years. None of them have met, Caroline's daughter. And it's like this entire little sort of fake family was just completely decimated.
But there's definitely a sense of malevolence in Five Little Pigs that you don't have in A Murder's Announced. There's more of a sense of escalating desperation. So like you said before, Eric, that, it's a very sympathetic novel in which the murderer is just, she's wrecked at the end. And you don't see that in Five Little Pigs. You see somebody whose life is destroyed, but they're not willing to admit that they're going to change or that it was important. I mean, they're very sort of dead inside, but they're not repentant in any way, or sad about it, and just don't care that sort of the havoc that they have caused. So I think even though, it's very two distinct, different sort of murders, and even though things are awful and horrendous, and you had to say in A Murder's Announced, there's a higher body count, and you think that would be more horrible, but you're very sort of sympathetic, because you like these characters. And
and it is interesting in Murder in Retrospect or Five Little Pigs. It's one of the few where there's only one dead body by the end of the book still. And
the murderer gets away with it, technically.
Technically, yeah. But it is, I think, Christie's allowing us to be a bit, her last line as she kind of walks off stage in all of her regal glory is, I died. She's the murderess, but when she killed the man she loved, I died.
And she's wrapped up in fur.
And she's wrapped up
in that lifestyle that she so craved.
And it's empty and miserable, and she hates everything about herself. And it's sort of, well, there it is. That's, I guess that is, and in a way, Poirot has brought that artificial family back together, and they've rejected her. She's kind of finally forcibly evicted from that group, but the Blake brothers have kind of reconciled. Caroline is back, or not Caroline, but Caroline's daughter is back, and Angela is back, and even Miss Williams, who, again, lesbian. It's sort of the most recent adaptation of this, the David Suchet Five Little Pigs, is really interesting in that it makes Philip Blake, it explains his hatred for Caroline and his devoted attachment to Amyas as a homosexual attraction. That Amyas kind of teases him with fulfilling, but never actually does. And so so the brothers actually kind of mirror each other in that Meredith is devoted to Caroline and Philip is devoted to Amyas.
Right.
And it makes a nice little
I
sort of
kind of
parallel.
got that sense reading it, though. I did get a little bit of, he reacted very strongly to this marriage in a way that was a little out of character.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it seems she definitely throws characters like who are so adamant about hating the other sex and being single and things and have very close attachments with people of the same sex. It's sort of like, I see what you're getting at here, you know. She's not unaware of such things.
Right. There's always some sturdy English woman who's good at games or good at organizing things. Like, I'm coding here. What am I seeing here? So there's always that, brogue wearing, tweed wearing single woman with, strong cheekbones.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but we haven't talked about Harley Quinn, who is sort of the oddball in the mix here.
Yeah, she has a bunch of short stories, many of which feature, Marple or Poirot. Some even, feature Tommy and Tuppence. But she has a bunch that are sort of free-floating, and a lot of them have to do with, like, little mysteries that sort of involve lovers reconciling in various ways. She's kind of... That was one of her... And she wrote romance novels on the side under a pseudonym, which I think is hysterical. But she did these, and these stories are like, of everything we read, they're the earliest. The Harley Quinn Harley Quinn stories were all written in the 1920s, which I think is fascinating because she makes the main character, Mr. Satterthwaite, an old man, and the fact that his wisdom of years is what gives him this sort of experience. And she does the same with Poirot and, Marple. She doesn't write about young people even when she's young. She writes about old people, which I think is interesting. But they all revolve around this character, these stories, at least, of Mr. Quinn, who appears in various ways when things are about to unfold and kind of trigger. He's a catalyst, is even the phrase Mr. Satterthwaite uses. This Mr. Satterthwaite, who's sort of a non-Belgian, non-professional detective version of Poirot. He's sort of a very keen observer of life and its dramas, to act at the right moment, to often save a life or to bring, unhappy lovers back together or things like that.
Feels like a bit like a prototype to something like Sapphire and Steel in a sort of 1930s way.
Well, yeah. Well, Harley Quinn he's a flatly supernatural character. There is no rational explanation for him. She doesn't seek to provide one, and she has other novels that have, the occult or elements of it being real. That just like the plot hinges on the fact that certain things are actually true. Like, and that's just something she occasionally incorporated. She usually kept it out of the Poirot and the Marples, but these other short stories and these other novels often feature it, like Pale Horse and Siddiford Mystery and things like that. And here
this is definitely sort of magical realism.
Yeah. What did you think? Because I adore these stories as a whole. Like, each individually, I think they're varying quality, but the sort of cumulative effect they make for me is really fascinating and really interesting. But I don't. Most people don't read these, and so I don't know what anyone else ever thinks about these.
I remember reading these for the first time and desperately wishing there were more, because I really, really liked this character, and I liked the relationship that he had with Satterthwaite, because he and Mrs. Marple or Miss Marple sort of reminded me of elderly observers of life who have lived a very long time and have seen a lot of things. But you get, and especially at the end of this book, you get the sense that Satterthwaite really hasn't engaged in life or hasn't lived the life. And that's sort of a lazy way of going about it, sort of being a vampire in everybody else's life, of just sort of taking everybody else's experiences in and watching it. So I thought the relationship was fascinating. And I really, I want more Harley Quinn. I wish there was more Harley Quinn out there, because it's a different type of story, and it really makes you sort of observe in a way that the Marples and the Poirots don't. And it's, there's always a love angle, especially in this collection of short stories. And it's people poking other people to get to the truth rather than them getting to the truth, which it's a different storytelling technique for Christie, and I think it works really well. And I wish these stories were a little bit more appreciated because I think they are pretty strong.
I think there's a lot of skill involved in trying to pack what can be quite a sort of complex genre into a very small page count.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to set it up and then explain the mystery in a relatively small amount of pages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed them. I didn't make it right the way through the book, I have to say. I got about 3/4 through. That was the last one that I tackled. But the ones I read I thought were really good fun.
Just read the last one, Harlequin's Lane or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Because that's the one where she finally essentially lays bare the relationship and the dynamic and what Harlequin represents and what forces he gathers. And it's actually super duper Freudian. Like not only the sort of psychoanalytical approach where you just kind of provide enough information that the person who already has the answer comes up with it themselves, which is, a lot like the therapeutic talking cure method. But Harlequin, which initially seems like a sort of like an impulse of love, but he also is death. And he's sort of this, he's the Eros and the Thanatos drives kind of combined. And that becomes really clear in the last story. It's been hinted at that, he speaks for the dead and things like this, but that he actually also is sort of the allure, the eternal lover that is death. And that's why Satterthwaite can kind of see him, but can't fully appreciate what he does. He's kind of both never loved, and because of that, he's kind of never really lived. And it's a very interesting dynamic that he literally at times when he only appears to that one man and no one else can even see that Quinn is there. And then there are times where it's like, oh, Quinn's here. And it's sort of like he's just another guy. And I love that he kind of shifts between reality and unreality in a really interesting way. And the stories by themselves are pretty solid lovely little mysteries with, oh, that's how you did it,
Yeah, they're like these little nuggets that have sort of an overarching of theme to them, and it is a little Freudian, and sometimes it's a little obvious, especially at the very last story that you're talking about. Lovers Lane either ends in a dump or at a cottage, sort of thing. Which we beat that over your head a couple times, but this time reading it through, you almost I kind of got the sense because there's this sort of trope in literature where death is not one person; it's kind of a role that's assumed, sort of the Santa Claus. Once Santa Claus goes, a new Santa Claus takes its place, and you kind of bind to that contract. And I'm really pulling in some really bad, 1990s movies now. But, I could see Mr. Satterthwaite becoming the next Harley Quinn.
Yeah.
As somebody who observes, but yet does not take part and sort of prods the action. So, that was something that occurred to me at the end of this. I'm like, I never thought about that before. But yeah, you can kind of see this as a role that's sort of passed on. But that last story just sort of hits you in the gut a little bit because it ends in a very plaintive note. And you really feel badly. And I know there's more stories out there, and now I want to go back and read them more because I don't remember what happens next.
I think there's one other. I might be wrong. There's one other, at least, called the Harlequin tea set that I actually finally found in the collection that is named after it at a used bookstore in Maine a couple summers ago. Because it's just not widely published in the States, because it essentially is, I believe it's only the one, and it's set sometime after, and it's sort of the last time. It's Satterthwaite, he kind of says, I knew I would see you one last time, essentially, kind of thing, and he gets to have one more moment where he gets to save the day, essentially. But yeah, no, but you're right. It's this overarching theme and the kind of pushing towards this sort of final moment where, he can't save Quinn appears, and it's not because anyone's going to be saved. It's because something terrible is going to happen. There's nothing you can do to prevent it, sort of, in a way. And
it's the opposite of life, where Quinn is saving these lives at the end. There's a life that cannot be saved.
Yeah, a life that cannot be saved, and by, the accounts of what they want, never wanted to be saved in some way. Like you get the impression that the ballerina, whose name I've forgotten, kind of only lived because it was inertia in some way. she kind of kept on going when she gave up dancing, and then she gets to dance her final dance with Harlequin. That's not too subtle. And finds herself on the rubbish heap.
Beat you over the head.
It does. But it's, she's not exactly subtle, but the fact that she's even reaching for something, I think, is commendable. And you'd even get kind of almost dreamlike when he's describing the dance, the little, village harlequinade they put on, and South Waite's watching it, and sort of like really drifts from scene to scene to the point you're kind of reading it. You're like, I have no idea what's going on at this point. Like, is this still actually happening, or is this some sort of weird fantasy? And the first time I read it, I had to read it through like 3 times just to make sure I knew what was actually happening to the characters and what was simply imaginings. But you're right. It leaves, our little proto Mr. Poirot hero broken and kind of embittered. And he says, I never walked down your lane. I never walked down Lover's Lane, and sort of there it is. Yeah, it's quite sad, but I really enjoy those stories.
I think
I sense that Deb is going to go off and write some fanfic now.
No, sadly, no time in the day. Of the 4 stories that we read, I think the one that you could probably do the most, sort of serious literary critique would be Harley Quinn. Because that's the one I think is the most ambitious. It's not just telling an interesting story or telling a good yarn. It actually sort of delves into some themes that she doesn't do in her classic thrillers and mysteries. So it's sort of an interesting break, but they're really good stories that give you a lot to chew on. Where the other, like the N or M, it's a story, it's a thriller. And the thing that makes it enjoyable is not the story itself, because at some point I was convinced it was Betty the baby who was the murderer or was the spy, because it was too twisty, and I'm trying really, really hard to throw you off the trail, and I'm sure this baby talk is really not baby talk. But what makes this story charming isn't that it's a good yarn. It tries to be more than that. And I think it does so quite successfully. If you're choosing to give it a close read. You don't have to, but if you did want to give it a close read, there's stuff to chew on in the Harley Quinn stories, I think.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And even the fact that she kind of has this weird obsession with the Harlequin characters and the Commedia dell'arte, which appear in several other places in her works. It seems it's a recurring motif, and that she chose that image, and it's there's something quite interesting in those books going on.
Mark, what was because there's 4 very different books here. I mean, what was your favorite of the 4?
I think it would have to be the Marple story. I think I'm a bit of a traditionalist. I like the sort of that sort of classic quintessential whodunit in the English countryside. I think there's some great characters in there. That for me is the thing that makes Christie stand out, is her ability to create really interesting and fun characters. And it's a real roller coaster ride. I love that story. I think that was my particular favourite of the 4.
Yeah, there is speaking of adaptations, there is an excellent adaptation of this that was done in the most recent iteration of Marple. It was done in the first or second series, so it was still Geraldine McEwen as opposed to Julia Mackenzie playing Miss Marple. With, oh my God, I've forgotten her name, but Cassandra from Doctor Who.
My brain is just died.
No, it's completely her, but she's very good. She's a very good actress, and she also plays Ariadne Oliver in the Poirots with David Suchet. But in this, she plays. Pretty sure it's her playing Miss Blacklock, but I might be making that up now. Now I'm worried I'm imagining that. But anyhow, the adaptation is very well done, and they really they kind of change one moment slightly so that the pearl breaks happens as Marple's unraveling the mystery, and she kind of grabs the pearls, and the pearls fall down, and you see the scar, and it's sort of like all revealed at that moment, but it makes it very dramatic and very sort of, it's a really solid adaptation of the book, and it also pushes the lesbian element a bit more to the fore, which is nice to see in this day and age.
I don't know if you guys have had the last of the Poirots over in America.
No,
yet.
I don't think it'll air this spring. I think.
don't know. Do they end up on PBS or?
Yeah,
I don't know quite how they find their way.
Yeah, they do end up on PBS via Mystery, Masterpiece Mystery, I should say.
Yeah, Mystery, Masterpiece Theater. Yeah.
Yeah, I watched Curtain in the Week and it's a real tearjerker for obvious reasons if you've read the book. But it's very well played out. There's a few Doctor Who connections within the cast. You've got Anne Reid in one of the roles,
Anne
and
Reid.
also Sean Digwall as well,
Oh.
who was Rose's dad in the reboot.
Do you know, I have never seen any of those Poirots.
None of them?
Oh, they're superb.
None of them.
Oh,
You
my
know,
goodness.
I tend to be the type of person, I like the books, and I tend to be disappointed in adaptations, so I tend not to seek them out. And
Oh, wow.
but I'm hearing so many good things about them because the series is wrapping up.
Yeah.
That I'm really tempted now to go back and see.
And they're really...
I think David Suchet and Hugh Fraser do a great job of playing the
I
two.
can't wait to see Curtin
two
just to
main
see Hugh
heroes.
Fraser back as Hastings. That would be lovely.
He's
It's
brilliant.
Yeah.
Sherlock and Watson all over again.
Yeah, which is what she did. Then she realized
Pretty
I don't
much.
need Watson. You know, she kind of realized that Watson was sort of a literary need that Conan Doyle had that she didn't, and so she kind of sent him off to the Argentine and didn't really bring him back until the very end. They insert him into quite a few stories where he's not in the adaptations.
Yeah.
But they even stopped doing that once they just started doing the books and had run out of all the short stories, which is what they originally started with. And but yeah, no, Suchet is, I think, will probably go down as the definitive Poirot, because as good as
have
Albert
to
Finney
agree.
is in Murder on the Orient Express, he kind of he's a bit too bombastic in some ways, I think, maybe, where Suchet is he's one of the few people who can say the line, "I do not approve of murder," which is a famous Poirot quote, without making it sound ridiculous. He makes it sound like a very serious moral judgment, which is skill, which is tremendous skill.
It's one of the few programs that would make me switch to ITV because I don't really tend to watch much on that channel, but it's really well made.
All right.
Sorry, all you Downton Abbey fans.
Well, here's a question for everybody. Do you think that the Agatha Christie stories still have something to offer to readers today? I mean, because they are, in some ways, they are very dated, and they are of a world that no longer exists. And sometimes the prose is a bit hackneyed, or even of a literary time and place that we don't subscribe to these days. Is it something that you think still has merit to a modern reading audience?
I think there's a certain charm to them, and I like. Well, I'm particularly interested in that period of history, so I'm perhaps somewhat biased anyway. But I think they're just a real damn good read. It's something you can pick up. It's I think you guys said it's comfort reading, and I think that's the perfect way of selling it.
I think that's true.
I don't know what you think, Eric.
I think that's true, and I think I'd even go further and say she's probably still the best puzzle writer who's ever lived. I mean, no one can kind of give you all the pieces and laugh at you as you fail to put them together and then show how easy it is at the end, quite like Agatha Christie. To the point where when a murder's announced, she actually gives you a list of all the things you should know. She gives you a list. She, it's not the only time that she does that, where you find the detective's list and you see it and you're like, I don't know. This isn't doing it for me. I don't know how that works. She's very, very, very good at that. Her sort of her spy stuff, and her later works, the kind of puzzle skill falls off. I would say anything written after 1960 or so is a bit rough in that respect. But anything from 20 to 1960, I would say, is pretty solidly worth reading in that regard. And when she wants to, she doesn't always care to, but when she wants to, she can do really proper character studies.
Have you guys read the ABC Murders?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a doozy.
That is that.
And it's quite an unusual kind of way of telling the story
Yeah,
as well.
that's very weird for her too, because it is essentially it looks like it's Poirot investigating a serial murder, like a serial killer is on the loose. But of course she puts her own spin on it, which is quite interesting. The only I won't say the only, but of course the one book that we haven't talked about that doesn't fall into any of these categories, but that is a must read for Christie, is And Then There Were None, or 10 Little Indians, depending on which edition you have. That is a book that laughs at you when you fail to figure it out, because literally all the characters are dead at the end. And it's only because the murderer sent a letter ahead of time. Oh, actually, I think it's a shipment note in a bottle, actually. I think it's as romantic as that. that you find out what the solution is. And it is fascinating. It's the beginning of the slasher genre, arguably, because it's people being picked off one by one until everyone's gone. And it is so well done that it's sort of impossible to piece it together, even though really everything is there. So I would strongly recommend that too.
Some of these books are just like master classes in how to spin a really good mystery. And you rarely feel cheated at the end of the story saying, well, there's no way I could have gotten that. There's no way I could have figured it out. Because she does give you enough elements that you should be able to at least be thinking in the right direction, if not outright, being able to figure it out. But you never do. You very rarely are able to figure out. Or if you suspect it might be a particular character, you can't imagine how it got there or how it happened. And then she spins it out, the big drawing room reveal, and it just makes so much sense. And you're like, this is brilliant. Like, why couldn't I have thought of that? But it's amazing. And her observations of people, she definitely, the characters are so well drawn, sometimes a little broadly, particularly with her foreign characters. But, just the observation of how people act and how people navigate their way through their own particular society is very, very astute. And I think she does that particularly well, even, sort of giving the social constraints of the times that she was writing and sort of the inherent prejudice. But,
And I think that's what makes them still relevant today. You asked earlier, are they still relevant? And I think it's the character study that's still relevant because people, although times change, people's motivations quite often don't.
That's very Miss Marple of you.
It is, and it's actually interesting. Like
I'm knitting as we speak.
The doctor has that really over-the-top speech in Unicorn and the Lost, the Doctor episode where Agatha Christie is that character, where she, he claims that Agatha Christie understands humanity. And I remember watching at the time being like, oh God, that is so overblown. But she actually is like, these books are some of the ones that show that she has at least some grasp on what it is that actually drives people. And not in the good way, but some of the darker things that drive people. And that is always, I think, Miss Marple has a lot of wonderful phrases about evil. She's like, oh, it's real, it is out there, it exists, and it's more common than you think. And she's like, I often believe the worst because it so unfortunately turns out to be true. All this sort of stuff. And that's really, Christie was kind of like that she was always aware that people sometimes were just bad or made really bad moral decisions. But
the one thing that she did well, Miss Marple's never bitter about this knowledge. And that's one thing, you think of a modern protagonist in these stories, they would just be twisted up and in therapy or have a drinking problem because they've just seen too much of life. Well, Miss Marple's, a pretty happy person, sitting with her knitting and her tea and being happy, to have these events at the vicarage with Bunch. And it hasn't changed her or warped her. It's just made her more observant, which I think is part of her charm, that she's not naive in any way, shape, or form, but she's not embittered by it either, which is, I don't think you would get that in
I think
writing.
No, I don't think you would. I think you would have just sort of everything's horrible and miserable and people are terrible, whereas Christie always shows that, but then she almost always also has a parallel, like romance storyline that's much smaller. But, young lovers reunited or whatever, or people who meet each other and things. Like, she feels the need kind of always to sort of remind you, but life is often quite good. And people fall in love, and love is great, and marriage can be wonderful, and sometimes good people are rewarded, and happiness prevails. It's not always, but it does happen, and that's sort of, she kind of does always remind you, not always, but often remind you that, there's a lot of evil out there too, but often there's good. And I think that's why she kind of she refuses to just let herself be grumpy.
Right. Yeah. She's not bowed by life, but she's certainly not naive about it either, which good stuff.
Do we have a book that perhaps we haven't covered so far today, or one of the ones we have today that you would kind of throw out to listeners who haven't read a Christie story before, you'd like to recommend?
If you don't want to read these four because we spoiled them for you, I would say you could always go with Murder on the Orient Express for Poirot. I would probably say for Marple, if you wanted to go that way, I would actually go the 13 Problems, which is a short story collection of 13 stories.
I like Murder at the Vicarage too. That's one.
Which is her first. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's quite sour at times in that one, but it's nice to see her. She gets softer later on. And then I would say, like I said, I think, and then there were none is kind of required reading in some way, and also if you went into the Mousetrap, which is the longest running play in human history.
It's still running, isn't it? I think
it's still running. It's still running. Oh, and Witness for the Prosecution, of course. Which the film version of was Charles Laughton and what's her face, the German woman, sexy tuxedo. Marlene Dietrich is an amazing movie, and you should all check it out. And it's very Christie.
I'm trying to think of what the name of the Tommy and Tuppence short story collection was, and I'm drawing a blank because I remember enjoying that one a lot.
Isn't that Partners in Crime?
Yes, it is Partners in Crime. Yes, because Secret Adversary was their first, and I don't think that's their strongest. It definitely introduces them in the banner. They fall in love, and it's wonderful. They have a great relationship. But I think Partners in Crime is definitely. I think it's probably their stronger of that sort of. Yeah, I would definitely recommend that if you're interested in more Tommy and Tuppence. But it's hard to go. I mean, these novels are classic for a reason. I mean, there's a reason why people still talk about Murder on Orient Express, because they're just really good, solidly built stories. And, if you're looking for a little bit of escapism, I don't think you can beat Christie. Except for The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which I'm still a little bitter about. I wouldn't recommend that starting Christie, even though it's her first. I
have a coworker
suggest it as a first.
I have a coworker who read that first, and he said everything felt like a cheat afterwards. Yeah. But no, a nice Christie and a cup of tea and a little quilt around your legs. That's a lovely Tuesday evening in, as far as I'm concerned.
Definitely comfort reading. It definitely is.
Yeah. I mean, I would go for Evil Under the Sun, which is a Poirot mystery, which I rather enjoy. Mainly because of the location, because it's based on somewhere very close to where I live, which is kind of cool. And also, have you guys read Dumb Witness?
Yes, about the dog.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I read that ages ago. Gosh, I can barely remember what it's about now.
Yeah.
Poirot does another one of his kind of adopting different guises to get information out of suspects. And I found that quite an interesting one. Yeah. So I'd probably throw those two into the hat as well.
Well, there you go. We have a reading list now. Christie reading list.
So I always do this at the end of a show. We'll ask you just to recommend a few things, not necessarily Christie related, that you've been enjoying recently that you'd like to recommend to our listeners. So I'm going to put Erik on the spot first. What would you like to recommend?
I'm going to go super duper highbrow. Earlier this week, I went to the movie theater, which through one of these sort of arrangements was screening the Metropolitan Opera from New York. It was a rebroadcast, but they also do it live screening in HD, and it was Tosca, Puccini's Tosca, and it was an amazing performance. The Met doesn't do bad. And they're available at, I think it's Phantom Events is the company that does it in the States. I'm not sure if it's always, but, I would just check everywhere, and they're available apparently on 6 continents. So there's probably one at least somewhere remotely near you. And if you're ever been curious about what it's like to go to the opera, that's a really good starting place. And they're just fascinating performances, and they're really, really super well done. So you should check that out.
I think it's a nice way to bring it into the mainstream, because I think possibly it might be a thing over here, but it seems perhaps a little bit difficult for the everyday person to wander into an opera house and watch a performance.
Yeah, tickets for the opera are in the hundreds of dollars. This was $20, and you could get popcorn. Yeah. So it's
it's a win.
Everyone's a winner.
Yeah, everyone's a winner.
How about
Well,
you,
I'm going to
Deb?
go really lowbrow, since how can you compete with Tosca? Come on. Obviously this week has been all about Doctor Who because we're leading up to the 20th anniversary next weekend. So there's been lots of
50th.
really good stuff. But I'm not
The 50th?
Did I say? I've done this so many times. I'm traveling backwards in time. The 50th anniversary, of course. So that has been eating up a lot of brain space. But sort of my biggest guilty pleasure currently is Sleepy Hollow. Which is a bonkers television show that's currently airing in the States on Fox, which I think you guys might be getting. We're just starting to get. And it is literally the craziest thing I have ever watched in my life. And it is Irving Washington's Legend of Sleepy Hollow, sort of Buffy the Vampire Slayer style, where Ichabod Crane wakes up in 2013, Sleepy Hollow. There is a headless horseman who at one point is wielding an AK-47. There's witches.
Okay.
I think George Washington is a demon hunter. I mean, it is crazy cakes, but it's done in such a way, it knows it's crazy. It's not taking itself seriously, but it's telling a good story seriously. It's an incredibly diverse cast. It's doing so many things right in a way that at the end of every episode, you're just shaking your head like, what did I just watch? And it's sucking me back in every single week. And it's become an amazingly surprise hit just because of it's not disrespecting itself, but it's not taking itself seriously. So I would recommend that, and if you just want a rollicking good time.
Yeah. I mean, on a similar note, I've been watching the latest series of American Horror Story.
Oh, God, yes.
Which, you're talking about crazy stuff. This is definitely within that kind of remit. I think Erik has got a phrase which I've adopted more recently, which is banana pants crazy.
Yeah.
And that's definitely banana pants crazy. The cast is brilliant. I mean, they have the sort of an ensemble cast that they like to carry on from series to series, but they've introduced a few more really high-profile actors into it this year, and I think it's really, really just appointment viewing. So I really like that. And also Walking Dead as well. We've got the 4th series of that going, and I'm a bit of a sucker for that, so I've been enjoying that. And also I've got a recommendation for Erik. Because you're going to be coming over to the UK fairly soon, aren't you?
Yes, under a month.
Now, if you happen to find your way, I know London is kind of the mecca for you guys when you come over, but if you find your way outside of London, about an hour to drive from where I live is Agatha Christie's holiday home called Greenway House. And it's fascinating to walk around. You get to see her typewriter and lots of Agatha Christie related paraphernalia, and you'll also get a bit of an insight into some of the locations as well, because having read the Five Little Pigs, that I don't know if it's said explicitly somewhere, but it seemed to be very much like Greenway, the description of the landscape and where the house sits. It's very reminiscent of that. So if you find your way down this way, it'll be definitely one to go for.
That is definitely something to add to the list. Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for coming onto the show. I really appreciate it.
That was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having Deb.
So where can we find you guys? Deb first. Where can we find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at Deb Stanish. You can find me on Verity Podcast at verypodcast.com, where we talk about all things Doctor Who. And through the Verity Podcast link, you can find links to blogs and everything else. So that's probably the easiest place to fall down the rabbit hole.
And it's a fun ride too. I mean, I have to say, I really enjoy your podcast. I listen to it usually within minutes of downloading. It's one of those ones that I really enjoy. Likewise, Erik, I don't want you to feel left out.
That's
you
it.
just starting another
That's
podcast
it.
now.
Yeah, there's a third. Yeah, no, you can also find me on Twitter at SJC Austenite, AUSTENITE. And if you just Google my name, you'll actually find that on Twitter. And yeah, there are 3 podcasts. There's the Doctor Who Book Club podcast, which comes out at the end of the month. There's Doctor Who The Writer's Room, which comes out middle of the month. That's just a new episode just dropped yesterday on Terrence Dix. And then there's the non-Doctor Who podcast that also comes at the end of the month called the Classic Horror Cast, where we talk about classic horror movies. This month's movie is Psycho.
Sweet.
Yes.
Nothing like making the rest of us podcasters feel like slackers here.
Yeah.
3? Seriously, 3.
Three.
Okay.
3. Yeah.
That's just the 3 we know about. I mean, I'm sure he's got a few more.
Oh yeah. There are, dozens of others that I do secretly.
The secret podcast of Erik Stadnik.
Secret podcasts. Yeah, they're for spying purposes.
Thank you both so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you.
I kind of figured I'd offer this service to Doctor Who podcasters who just need a break from talking about Doctor Who, and they can talk about something else instead.
Oh, aren't you sweet? Taking one for the team.
Yeah. Oh, and it's such hard work as well. I mean, having great guests every time, it's just, I don't know. I'm sure I'll cope somehow.
Your life is so hard.
It is.
I really appreciate you inviting me on. That's good.
Thank you very
lots
much.
of fun.
What's your happy hour?
Fantastic.
Sweet.
I know, which will be awesome. We only live like 2.5 hours from each other. We're not that far. Which
Your profile picture on Skype is very pop culture happy hourish.
Yes. What can I say? So yeah, and it doesn't. It's really not that far, but trying to coordinate things can be tricky.
Very tricky. Yeah.
Very tricky.
We need to have Eric and Glenn Weldon on a podcast together. That would be
Oh
awesome.
my God. I would definitely have a fangasm.
I'm not sure if the universe might not explode, but it'd be worth it.